Our notes tonight focus on Boston, the city of Boston, and really the central role that Boston plays in the build up to the American Revolution. So the notes are kind of a little bit longer tonight, and they're broken into 5 parts that are listed right here on the screen. The first one we're going to talk about is a very well-known event, the Boston Massacre. And here you see the famous engraving from Paul Revere that shows the colonial viewpoint of how this went down. But as we will see, that's not really quite what happened. So in a previous set of notes, we discussed the Stamp Act and how that was put into place after the French and Indian War to raise money, and how the colonists hated it because they felt it was an unfair tax. They weren't being represented in Parliament. So Britain gave in to colonial pressure, and they repealed the Stamp Act. And after repealing the Stamp Act, Britain turns around and passes new taxes, right? They took away one tax, and they replaced it with new ones. And these were called the Townshend Acts. So you can imagine the colonists were happy that one got taken away, but now they're upset because another one has been passed. British officials also cracked down on smuggling and sort of cheating the rules to get around the taxes. And England sent more soldiers and more royal officials to the colonies to enforce the rules. Things in Boston were probably as bad as it got. The soldiers that were there end up competing with the citizens for jobs. Soldiers and citizens were both, there's instances of both sides really behaving pretty poorly, pretty childishly. And that included things like shoving each other in the streets, taunting each other. The British troops holding band practice during church. Name calling, and even throwing things, and as I said, shoving and kind of getting violent with each other. Things really come to a head in 1770. One night there's a crowd of colonists and some soldiers who confront each other in front of the customs house. The crowd was taunting the soldiers. They're angry at the soldiers for taking their jobs and for even just being in the city. And they started throwing things at the soldiers, like clubs and even chunks of ice. And so they're not an innocent, peaceful crowd. The soldiers are told not to fire, but one of them fires, and that causes others to fire. And before you know it, 5 colonists lay dead in the streets of Boston. The soldiers were put on trial in the colonies, but they were mostly found not guilty. There were 2 soldiers who were found guilty of a lesser crime than murder called manslaughter, and they were branded on the thumbs with the letter M for manslaughter. But the rest of the soldiers got off because the court found out, that they were provoked. The crowd was not innocent bystanders. However, the Sons of Liberty called it the Boston Massacre, and they used the news of the massacre to fire up the other colonies, including the engraving that Paul Revere made showing the British troops lined up being ordered to fire on a peaceful crowd of colonists. And this image kind of goes viral, so to speak, in the age before the internet, and it gets published in other colonies, and news of the massacre spreads and really stirs up a lot of anger at the British. The next major event we're going to talk about is the Boston Tea Party. And so here's another engraving showing the Tea Party. Again, not terribly accurate, but that wasn't really the point. After the Boston Massacre, Parliament tries to calm things down, and they decide to cancel all of the taxes on the colonies. But not too long down the road, Parliament passes something called the Tea Act. The Tea Act, cleverly named, put taxes on tea, and it gave a British company called the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. So the colonists love their tea, and they're now told you can't buy your tea from anyone else. You have to buy it from this British company, who can then charge whatever they want to charge. Well, the Sons of Liberty were determined not to pay this tax because they still feel that it's unfair. They're not being represented in Parliament. So they organized what they cleverly called a tea party to be held in Boston Harbor. Late at night in 1773, a group of men disguised themselves as Indians, and they boarded the tea ships that were floating in Boston Harbor, and they destroyed about 35,000 pounds of tea. Took the shipments, dumped them into the harbor. If you know anything about tea, obviously once it gets wet, it's kind of used up. So they destroy all of this tea. Now, they were not trying to be clever dressing as Indians. It was not designed as no one will know it's us. Everyone knew who it was. So they really weren't trying to disguise themselves so much as they were just kind of goofing around. Well, obviously the company and its stockholders were furious. They expected that the British government and the British soldiers were going to protect their property. And how could they let this group of rebels destroy all of this tea? And on top of that, you had many, many powerful people in England, including the king himself, who owned stock in the company. So Parliament has got to do something about these rebels in Boston. And what they do is pass something that in the colonies becomes known as the Intolerable Acts. So here's another engraving by Paul Revere showing the colonial view of the Intolerable Acts, that Britain is forcing these on the colonists and pouring tea down its throat. Not a very happy view for the colonies. So Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts to punish Boston for the Tea Party. And this punishment would stay in place until the tea was paid for. And there were several parts to the punishment. One, the British Army was put in charge of Boston. Citizens of Boston were forced to house the soldiers and feed them. Massachusetts lost the right to govern itself. The royal governor was given just about total control of the colony, and local town meetings were banned. British officials who were accused of crimes in the colonies would be sent to England for trial. You might be thinking, well, I don't really understand that. Why is that a big deal? Well, think about it. If you're a soldier here in the colonies and you know that you're not going to be put on trial in the colonies, you might feel more free to abuse the colonists because you could get away with it. And the fourth part of the Intolerable Acts was to shut down Boston Harbor. So nothing could come in, nothing could leave through the harbor. And that hurt businessmen. And some people even said could contribute to the people of Boston starving. And I don't think it ever quite got that bad, but certainly people lost their jobs and lost their businesses because the harbor was shut down. In response to what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, Boston asked the other colonies to help. And you start to see cartoons going around like this that are saying, hey, we've got to join together. We can't let Britain chop us apart, because if we're apart, we're going to die. We need to join together so we can survive. Which brings us to the First Continental Congress, which took place in Philadelphia. In response to Boston's call for help, 55 delegates from 12 different colonies met up in Philadelphia to figure out how are we going to respond to the Intolerable Acts, right? We got to help Boston out. We got to help Massachusetts out. So they decide to do a couple of things. First, the colonies decided we will boycott English goods. We're not going to buy any English goods. We'll tell the colonies to start gathering up weapons in case this heads for a fight. We need to be able to defend ourselves. We'll send another petition to the king, right? They tried that before. They said, we'll send another one. We'll tell the king how we feel. And we'll meet again if things don't improve. So England responds to this petition and this boycott by sending even more troops over to Boston and declaring that Massachusetts was openly rebelling against the king. So every single time, that there's this new tax and the colonies protest, it just nudges the temperature higher and higher and higher. And pretty soon, things are going to boil over. And they boil over into violence in the battles of Lexington and Concord. So what was going on was in Massachusetts, the towns would train their militias to get ready for what they thought was a coming fight. And they gathered weapons and ammunition to prepare for that fight, right? Just kind of being ready in case they needed it. So the British, centered in Boston, found out that the colonists had a huge supply of weapons in a city called Concord, or a town called Concord. They also found out that the Sons of Liberty, that sort of rebel group that was stirring up a lot of trouble, would be meeting in a town called Lexington that was on the way to Concord. So they're hoping to knock out two birds with one stone. The British left Boston in the middle of the night to try to go capture the colonists' weapons and leaders. And on their journey, the very first fighting of the American Revolution takes place in Lexington. No one's really sure which side fired first. There's accounts that say the British did, accounts that say the colonists did. No one really knows for sure, but 8 colonists were killed, and the colonists quickly scattered, right, in the face of organized British troops. The British continued on to Concord, where they ran into a larger group of colonists. The British suffered many casualties, meaning soldiers who were killed or wounded on their trip back to Boston, where for pretty much the whole way back they were getting harassed by groups of colonists who were shooting at them from behind trees and behind walls. So the colonists were able to actually inflict some damage on the British troops. And because riders, including Paul Revere, his famous midnight ride, had been sent out ahead of time to warn the colonists, the British troops didn't even capture the leaders or the weapons that they were going to capture. So it was pretty much a failure for the British troops. So here's your response question. We saw this picture earlier showing the colonial viewpoint of the Boston Massacre, the British troops firing into an unarmed crowd, the British commander yelling fire, and we learned that that's not really quite how it went down. So you'll have to print off your notes to do this, but go ahead and print them off. And in that space for the response question, I want you to draw a picture that shows a more accurate version of what happened.